Welcome to Bruce Hurwitz Presents Meet the Experts. I'm your host, Bruce Hurwitz of Hurwitz Strategic Staffing. You can find us on the web at hsstaffing.com. I hope you'll consider us for all your staffing, career counseling, and professional writing needs. I am delighted that I will be shortly joined by Gina Mundy. We will be discussing childbirth litigation. Meet the Experts is sponsored by P&K CPAs. P&K is a full-service accounting firm. They provide accounting and consulting services to businesses ranging from startups to small and mid-cap companies to nonprofits, as well as high-net-worth individuals. Contact them today for a free consultation at info@pk-cpas.com or call them at 973-882-8810. They will be happy to be of service. Gina, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you, Bruce, for having me today. I'm excited for our conversation.
As am I. Please take a moment or two and introduce yourself to our viewers.
Sure. So I'm a mom. That's always my most important job, mom of three. But I'm also an attorney specializing in childbirth cases. So for your audience, for people who don't understand what that may mean, if something goes wrong during the birth of a child and the baby's not born healthy, or in some very, very sad cases, I've had mom pass away, families will then bring a lawsuit against the hospital. And then that's where I come in. I'm one of the attorneys that will then defend the case on behalf of the hospital, the doctors, the nurses, or whatnot. So when that happens, my job is to come in, and I've done this for over 20 years. So my job is to kind of come in, figure out, okay, what happened, what went wrong, but more importantly, what should have been done so mom, would have been around to raise her baby, or what should have been done so baby would have been born healthy. So those questions, especially in the litigation setting, have taken me across the country just numerous times, in almost every state, probably almost every hospital system, meeting with these delivery teams, meeting with doctors, midwives, nurses, and just basically hashing out, every aspect of labor and delivery, the decisions that go into that, with the parents, and whatnot. So then based upon that experience, I made the decision then, instead of getting involved in the aftermath of something going wrong during labor and delivery, to then basically get involved before childbirth in hopes to prevent these mistakes. So I wrote a book to expecting parents on how to make sure they prevent these mistakes or help prevent these mistakes and complications. Work closer with your delivery team, give them some insights on basically what I've seen for the last 20 years, what I know. So hopefully they can help prevent these mistakes and complications and have a healthy baby. Because I'll tell you, the hardest part of my job is the day that I have to sit down with the families and talk about, the day their baby was born, or, the day they lost their mom. So it's very difficult. And, when I went back and I was looking at all these cases from the past 20 years, I also figured out that, there are common mistakes. There are reoccurring, mistakes during childbirth. So if parents know this, and then also I tried to help guide them. I technically wrote this book. My kids, my most important job, my kids. I have two older girls, they haven't had babies yet. They're not that old, but they're getting up there. I wrote it for them. So I also not only identified, hey, this is what you probably should know, before childbirth, but then this is how to make sure it doesn't happen during, the birth of, their child or your child. So so that's probably me in a very quick nutshell.
All right. Now, what fascinated me at first was the fact that you are involved in preventive legal action. And I was trying to think of other instances, because usually there has to be some injury, some damage, some harm, and then you call the attorney. In this case, it's not. And the only thing I could come up with was a prenuptial agreement to prevent divorce, a business partnership agreement, to make sure that if the partnership doesn't work out, that it doesn't become a nasty separation of what is one would presume had originally been two friends. So this is kind of unique in a way.
It is. It is. And basically another thing is, if it goes well, I shouldn't have a job. I'm basically hopefully decreasing the amount of work I have, which many people have, asked me if I was crazy, but I'm like, listen, it's not about that. It's about, like you said, the preventative. It's about making sure these babies are okay, the moms are okay.
No, it's a stupid statement, because as long as women get pregnant, there is a possibility of harm.
There is. And, I think one of the lessons, I even talk about in the book a little bit is, it's from the families, and it's, this mindset, and listen, we're all guilty of it. Only bad things happen to other people. So it's also taking that mindset and being like, listen, I've talked to these families, I've met these families. You cannot have that mindset going into childbirth. And if you prepare right and you have an understanding of what can go wrong, you're going to have the best chance possible to having a healthy baby. Now, listen, like you said, things happen. Listen, I get cases in, I don't think it's a case. I think nature took its course, and it's very, very tragic. And those are the cases we've had to take to trial and whatnot. But I've seen the other side of it. I've seen where mistakes and complications have taken the life of a baby and taken the life of a parent. And that's what I'm trying to prevent.
Well, that was going to be my next question. How do you know when it's just, for lack of a better term, an act of God, that nobody did anything wrong? There's no grounds for a lawsuit. It's frivolous. I worked at a nursing home. Long story short, nicer woman you'd ever want to meet. She passed away, and 6 weeks later, her grandchildren sued for abuse. Usually, we just say to the insurance company, you handle it. In this case, it was different because they had never visited her. She had not had a single visitor. Lovely woman, nobody visited her. And they were looking for a $25,000 payout or $50,000, something like that. And we said, no, not going to happen. We'll go to court. And they dropped it because they didn't want to pay for a lawyer. Whether or not they could have found a lawyer, because as I understand it, a lawyer has an obligation not to bring frivolous lawsuits to court. So how do you determine if something is an act of God and it would be frivolous to bring the case to court, to take the case?
Right. So, the best way, when I first started in this business over 20 years ago, for the first couple of years, I'd have no idea if it was frivolous or not. I'd have to call my experts and ask them, say, hey, what's the standard of care? Did they do anything wrong? Did this cause the death of the baby? Did this cause mom to die? I wouldn't know. But over 20 years, again, traveling this country, analyzing every aspect, studies, 8-hour cross examinations, you name it. It's my experience in this field. And you have to remember, every single labor and delivery is different. And the way somebody is managed, and everybody's different. There's no, it's impossible to have the same one. So I use my experience in this field from talking to the experts, from, all the stuff I've done, and I can look and say, okay, something's wrong, something went wrong, or something didn't go wrong, and it was an act of God. There's really not much more than that, because everything is always so different. It's really hard to distinguish, in general, this means they did something wrong, this means they didn't, because, when you're looking at these cases, you're like, okay, you're looking at the standard of care. Standard of care is what a reasonable and prudent physician would do under same or similar circumstances. Keywords, same or similar circumstances. So you have to look at those specific circumstances and kind of make that judgment call. And that really it just comes with time in this industry.
When I go for a blood test, I usually get checked in by a phlebotomist who sees my name, the script from the doctor, my date of birth, asks me to confirm it. And then literally 45 seconds later, we're behind a screen, and she looks at me and she says, "What is your name? What is your date of birth?" And I realized that this is just a procedure to make sure that there hasn't been a mistake. Now, in surgery, the surgeon asks, there's a checklist that they have to go down to make sure they have the right patient, and they're not going to, as has happened, as you know, amputate the wrong limb, let's say. Is there such a checklist in the labor room? Because you know what the woman is there for. I mean, it's no, you don't have to be a genius to figure that out.
Right. No, that's a great question. And there are things I do look for in these cases. Was mom on Pitocin? What's Pitocin? Pitocin's a drug that induces labor. It's being used more frequently now. Because I'll tell you, most of my cases involve Pitocin. So was Pitocin used? Was it used appropriately? When
Would they know if there was if the woman had an allergy to it, if she had never had a child before?
Right. So that's a great question, because every mom responds to Pitocin differently. So how one mom's going to respond may be totally different than how another mom responds. So while Pitocin is on my checklist, I look immediately, was mom induced? Because I need to know how that went and how she reacted to Pitocin. You're right. They all act differently. So, again, though, so was the drug Pitocin, used? Was another question that I always ask and I look at, was the labor and delivery unit busy that day? Because when they're busy, the delivery teams are spread thin, and mom and baby may not get the attention that they needed. So yeah, there actually is chapter 11 of my book. It's the reoccurring facts and issues in a baby case. So the first thing.
That's your list. Is there a list for the doctors and nurses?
Great question. I don't think so. I mean, unless they read my book. The cool thing about my knowledge is it is from representing doctors and nurses in different systems, and then also traveling the country and meeting with the different doctors and nurses to understand how they do things, get their perspective, their opinion based upon their knowledge, training, and experience with these patients. So, how one doctor does things, this is a big part of why I even have a job. Well, how one doctor does things may be completely different than how another doctor does it. So a checklist with something like this, maybe if they've looked at my book and they've, seen the reoccurring facts, maybe they'll pay closer attention to a baby or a mom, if they come in with something similar, in chapter 11 of my book. But otherwise, I don't think there's like a set checklist that they have in labor and delivery.
I was just smiling because you keep on saying chapter 11, and
It's my favorite chapter.
Yeah. There are people, and I say this with absolutely zero disrespect, who will refuse certain medical procedures, blood transfusions, for example. It's the one that comes to mind. There are, if because of a patient's religious beliefs, something was not done during the labor or during the pregnancy, for that matter, and as a result, tragedy occurred. Doesn't matter what the tragedy was. Tragedy occurred. does that exempt the physicians and the medical institutions who were treating the mother from any liability for the tragedy?
So it depends on what she was refusing. It depends on the tragedy. But I'll tell you, in general, that scenario would be my defense as the attorney for the hospital, the doctor, and the nurses. Absolutely 100%. If mom's the decision maker, they have to respect her decisions. So if she makes that decision, all I would ask is that the doctors, the hospital, whoever it is, the nurses, midwives, make clear documentation that mom is refusing. That's all they need to do. Make clear documentation, and your attorney will take care of the rest. Because they should not be on the hook because mom refused the treatment, because she is the decision maker and she ultimately gets to choose what happens. And that it should exempt them from any type of liability. Absolutely.
You represent the medical institution,
Yes.
not the.
I'm the attorney for
not
the delivery team. So the cases are filed by the families.
Okay.
I then represent everyone on the delivery team.
I don't know why I assumed you were representing the mother, but
Everybody,
the
it's
family.
fine. No, so we didn't talk about that pre-show. So that would be, so I've started to talk about that pre-show actually, because everybody who talks to me, especially in this atmosphere of a podcast, assumes I am the attorney for the families.
I never ask questions before the podcast begins. It's something I learned from watching Larry King being interviewed on Interviewing. And he said except for normal pleasantries, which we had, he would never ask a guest a question related to the interview because he didn't want to know ahead of time what the answer would be, because then it sounds like a fake interview. So
I usually do give the heads up though, even if you guys don't ask, because I'll tell you, I wrote a book to parents, but listen, people, the doctors, the nurses.
Well, that's why. I mean,
they're fine with it. I'm still an attorney. I'm still practicing. I still have my cases. They don't like it as much as I don't like it. It's not, I know hospitals, I feel like these days have a really bad rap, and maybe in some departments they do, but the ones that deliver babies, listen, I've heard some bad things about hospitals lately, and if it was true in terms of labor and delivery units, I would not represent them. So they don't want this. They're actually happy. They're like, oh my goodness, Gene, if you can prevent some lawsuits, even just financially, that beyond the happiness of, not losing a baby and not losing a mom. Because listen, when that happens, it's hard. It's hard on everybody. It's not, obviously the parents, I could never imagine, but it is a very hard thing on everybody involved. So in any way, if it can, be prevented, and they're on board. But
now I'm confused. I told you jokingly before we began that I would be asking you nasty questions. So this may actually be a nasty question. If you're representing the hospitals and the doctors, nurses, why don't you have a checklist that you share with hospitals of the various things they should do akin to what they do in regular surgery to make sure that mistakes aren't made?
I think it's a great question. And when I get these cases in, I do make recommendations to the hospitals.
I'm saying beforehand, as a way of marketing.
Right. So, in the aftermath, you're right. And again, that's my whole plan, right? To get involved before childbirth and not after. But right now, I do make recommendations on different changes to help prevent the mistakes. Now, in terms of a checklist, and here's some common facts in a baby case, that's a great idea. Maybe maybe I will. They've read my book. They know, the people I work for have read my book. They know. So, but
it's a parent's guide, not a doctor's guide or a hospital's guide.
Right. But it still has your common facts or
I understand
in a case. So like if the doctors, well, I've written this, to them, they know Pitocin is in the number one factor in the legal baby cases in the childbirth litigation setting. So everybody is on high alert that if we're using Pitocin, which is also known as one of the top 10 most dangerous drugs, it's a high alert medication. Only a few medications are on there. One of them's Pitocin. that they need to pay close attention to mom. So yes, I've made recommendations, like if mom's on pit, especially if it's they're turning it up, close attention and whatever. And they work, they do it. So in terms of an actual checklist, it's hard because every single patient's different. I mean, you may have one with diabetes, you may have one with high blood pressure, you may have one here, you may have one there. But no matter what, they know that if they have a high blood pressure, that's a high risk patient. They got to be careful. So, and there's high risk specialty for that. So they know if they're on pit. They know pit's the number one most. They work up these cases too with me, so they know.
What's the procedure when a patient lies?
Well,
Patient goes in, and I can't think of an example. I'm not as I sometimes have to say, I'm not that type of doctor. In this case, I can quote the line that I'm sure you have heard many times: I don't know nothing about birth and no babies.
mhm.
What happens if the mother or a family member lies to the doctor because they're worried about insurance, let's say, and they say, the whole list of diseases, they say no to everything because they're worried that the insurance won't cover the pregnancy, the delivery, what have you. They lie outright. Is that a get out of jail free card automatically for the hospital?
It depends. It depends. It depends. It depends. All these circumstances
I should
and
have banned you from
everything.
saying it depends. I
It
forgot.
depends. It depends. Listen, can it be a defense in a case and exempt them from liability? Absolutely. If that information was important and the doctors did not have that information and they were making recommendations with the wrong information and that caused something bad to happen to mom or baby, absolutely that's going to be one of my, one of our defenses. But again, it just goes back to it depends on the circumstances, the situation, and what that lie really was and what happened because of that lie.
What's the difference between a lie and a mistake? That the person, the family member, gives an incorrect answer, but there was no malice intended. They did not know, or they did not remember.
Okay. So if we were in a deposition, I'd be like, okay, can you restate your question? So you want me to talk about, like, I'll restate that. So
I'm laughing because I
mistake
was
versus
once
lie.
deposed, and the lawyers asked me, what did you think when you received notice that you were going to be deposed? I said, I was never aware of the fact that I was a ruler of a country. And if I had been aware of it, I would have treated my subjects with kindness and they would not have deposed me. She had no sense of humor. Things went downhill quickly from there. What I'm trying to get at is there are so many frivolous lawsuits filed. But on the other hand, there are good people who mean well and are harmed really through no intentional fault of their own. So, yeah, if the question was, were you a diabetic or are you a diabetic? And they say no, okay, I'm sorry, that's on you. But if they said, did you ever have an allergic reaction to anesthesia? And the only time the person had anesthesia was when they had their appendix out when they were 10 years old, and they don't remember what happened 30 years earlier. So they say no, but they did have a reaction. It's just nobody knew about it. And then the person's mother comes in and says, oh, yeah, you had a serious reaction when they gave you the anesthesia for your appendix.
So that would be for the jury to decide if we went that far, because that might be depending on the circumstances. If we think that's a legit defense, or we have a defense because of the, the information that that patient gave, and we, based on those facts, I take the case to trial, it'll be for the jury to decide whether they want to go with that excuse or not. If we decide we want to because of the circumstances, or we accept what they're saying, and then we, maybe do an earlier settlement, then that might be a possibility. But something like that, if it's a really big, important fact of the case, might end up being for the jury to decide on that. That might not even be for something for the attorneys to decide on.
When is it a jury trial, and when do you leave it to a judge to decide? Well, that wouldn't be.
You're gonna love my response. It depends.
Yeah, that wouldn't be your decision, because you're representing the hospital. That would be a decision for the plaintiff.
It's a decision, both parties have the, could try to settle the case. One party may hold out. Maybe one party thinks this is the best case ever, and the plaintiffs and the defense, thinks they have a good defense. So
if it's a jury trial or a judge trial.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, plaintiff will make, they'll demand it in the complaint for jury, trial by jury.
We're almost out of time, so I want to share your contact information. And I have a final question for you.
Oh, sure. And there's really quick with my contact information. My website also has all of my information on it, ginamundy.com.
Okay. Thank you. Final question. Is there anything I did not ask you that you wish I had asked you? And if I had asked you, what would you have said?
That's a great question. Well, you did not ask me too many questions about my book. So it is definitely, the one thing I'll say about my book, it is definitely not an ordinary pregnancy book. This is a book basically that I wrote after a very near close family tragedy. And baby's fine, everybody's fine. But it made me think, oh my goodness, what if I'm not around for the birth of my grandkids? So I wrote this book. So this book is like how basically a childbirth attorney who has seen all of these mistakes and complications, this is how I would prepare my family for childbirth. So it's much different than how like a family would traditionally prepare. So it's definitely a different book. It's not your ordinary pregnancy book, but it's everything that I think is important to make sure, parents can have a healthy baby and prevent these mistakes and complications. That's it.
And that's a goal I'm sure everyone shares.
Yeah.
Gina, thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it, and I'm sure our viewers do as well.
Oh, thank you, Bruce. It was nice talking to you.
My pleasure. I'm Bruce Hurwitz. Thank you for watching, and as always, please stay focused on success.